Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Can AI Be Responsible? A discussion about data ethics, where we will be discussing the consequences of data in our everyday decisions. Data influences every aspect of our lives, both personally and in business. Our panelists today will talk about the consequences and benefits of data's role in our decision-making. So how can AI be responsible, and how do you use data ethically? My name is Jeff Cohen. I'm the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at Informs, the largest association for the decision and data sciences. Informs members support organizations and governments at all levels as they work to transform data into information and information into insights that lead to better decision-making and more impactful results. Informs' 11,000 members are comprised of diverse and robust experts in data science, analytics, operations research, and other related fields. Their work touches literally every sector and has been responsible for saving lives, saving money, and solving problems across a broad spectrum of areas, including healthcare, transportation, artificial intelligence, and so much more. Today, we are joined by two Informs members and leading experts as we explore the topic of data ethics. First, we are joined by Aaron Burciaga, who is the chair of the Analytics Certification Board, which oversees the Certified Analytics Professional Certification Program, or CAP for short. His roles have included VP, CTO, and practice director of Fortune 500s and co-founder of data and technology startups. Aaron is a Forbes contributor and an appointed member of the U.S. Department of Commerce's National Technology Information Service Advisory Board. And perhaps most importantly, Aaron served 10 years active duty in the United States Marine Corps, graduate of the Naval Academy. Aaron, we thank you for your service. We're also joined by David Hunt, a vice president at Oliver Wyman. David has more than 30 years of experience helping public and private sector clients on projects involving regulatory and policy analysis, strategic planning, and operational improvements. He is currently a member of the Informs Board of Directors, a founder of Pro Bono Analytics, and chaired the Informs Committee on Ethical Guidelines. Aaron and David, thank you both for joining us. We appreciate you being here today for this very important conversation. Let me jump right into some questions. It seems like ethics, especially data ethics, can be open to a variety of perceptions or definitions, guidelines, interpretations. Is there any uniformity to data ethics? And where should people look to find common standards for the data science and the analytics community? And David, perhaps I'll start with you first.
Sure, Jeff. Thank you. So it seems odd to think about data or algorithms as being ethical or unethical. But if you view them as a source of advice, something that's giving you a recommendation like a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher, then you can start to identify ethical qualities that we would expect to come out of these algorithms and out of the data. So one is equity. Everyone deserves to be treated fairly and in a manner that is consistent with their best interest. This has gained a lot of attention in the media and books, newspaper articles, due to biases that have been found from these algorithms in loan processing applications, screening for job applicants, and parole recommendations. The second one is privacy. Another hot topic, sensitive information should not be disclosed or used in attempts to harm or manipulate people. And the third one is transparency, that you need to have clear and understandable reasons behind recommendations. Opaqueness breeds mistrust. You don't want these black box models that you can't understand. So I would say, Jeff, that there is uniformity in these three topics as being responsible artificial intelligence and ethical data. But the problem is that there is not uniformity in the solutions around them. And that's where a lot of work is being done today. So equity is a very desirable goal, but it's very difficult to achieve. I mean, the historical data may reflect biases that aren't consistent with current sentiments or with desired future states. If you think about the majority of people, the data is going to represent the majority. And so how do you, they will influence the data, they'll have a greater influence over the data and the results. So how do you make sure that minority populations are represented? I mean, that's one thing the United Nations came out with some ethics for AI guidelines, and they were very concerned about cultural differences and making sure that cultural differences are preserved. People rarely fit in a single category, but instead they find themselves at the intersection of multiple categories. And finally, maybe it's easy to identify something seems unfair, but there's often a lot of disagreement about what constitutes a fair outcome. On the privacy side, simply masking the names doesn't provide much security. There's a very famous case from 25 years ago where an MIT student was able to match zip codes and birth dates with confidential health records, found the information for then Governor William Weld of Massachusetts, and mailed his health records to his office. So, I mean, there's things like differential privacy that seem to work well. They're used in everything from iPhones to US Census data. But the problem with privacy is that it may not be in a company's best interest to make the data private, to put that privacy in the data because they're using it to market and to make money off of it. And finally, transparency. I mean, there are numerous hidden layers in AI models that make it difficult to interpret recommendations. I mean, there are different approaches to it, explainable AI, where you're building these post hoc models to try to understand what the original model was telling you, or interpretable AI, where you're building just simpler models that you can actually understand. So, your question about uniformity, Jeff, I would say equity, privacy, transparency, there's general agreement among those, but there's not general agreement in how you approach them and how you solve them.
Thank you, Dave. That was great. Aaron,
let me build on that. And I think before I build on it, let me just highlight maybe a problem that we have with answering this question. I think your question is, where can we look to for these standards? And what I would say is, as we're looking and as we're communicating, as we're listening, and as we're talking with each other, one of the things that creates a natural barrier, not only the culture and beliefs, but it's all compounded by language. And sometimes those terms and definitions are not well understood. I heard Dave talk about equity, and in some models, equity is excluded. I don't believe it's excluded because people don't think it's important, but because they're looking at the etymology of the word or the definitions that are being used to create these frameworks. So I'll just say one of the things that's extremely challenging in understanding the ethics is sometimes knowing where these ethics are coming from, the cultural or belief background, how it's compounded and made more difficult by the language we speak. Everything we're communicating now might be translated slightly different, even in my second language, Spanish, and therefore might have a slight nuanced difference in meaning. So honestly, I think a lot of this conversation is less about ethics and more about the transfer of information, the exchange of information to the frameworks we espouse. And so Dave, so if I shift now to what Dave was highlighting, I agree, it's critical for us to baseline on some frameworks. And I'll be brief in just saying that when we look to other very important vocations, such as the lawyers, the doctors, the dentists of our lives, there are these professional standards, these societies, these bars, and these licensures that ensure that there's a DDS or some other letters that come after a name that show a well-qualified expert. I don't think we yet, well, we do have it. I just don't think it's yet at its critical mass for people to look for the CAP or other type standards that can distinguish the good, the better from the best types of lawyers, dentists, and surgeons we have in the field of artificial intelligence, data science, machine learning, and AI. And those people subscribe, just like the lawyers, dentists, and doctors, those certified professionals in analytics and AI, subscribe to frameworks like Dave was just sharing. For me, my favorite framework consists of 6, and I'll just say them and I'll stop. The framework that I include typically in looking at responsible or ethical data, ethical AI, is accountability, impartiality, resiliency, transparency, security, and governance. Now you can see how those things that David said more or less fit within that. But again, it's the barrier of language. And I've seen responsible AI, responsible data models vary from three components to 6 components. The White House, I think, at one time had 18. So where do you look? Well, not always will government provide those best models, but I think those professional standards and societies that have been so important to lawyers, doctors, and dentists should be important today and going forward also.
Thanks, Aaron. As I was listening to you both, one of the things that occurred to me is that the world around us is not stationary, right? And technology and analytics and whatnot, very dynamic. And so I'm wondering, recognizing that, what is the role of data science and analytics practitioners in aligning data ethics with emerging technologies? Aaron, how about we start with you there?
If I may, kind of building where I came from and what has brought us all together. Informs is one of many societies that bring professionals, or I would say sometimes the aspiring quants together, right? And share things like bodies of knowledge and frameworks and certifications to raise the bar, not only on ourselves, but how these things are being delivered, and important practices ranging from military to medicine. How should those people in those societies be thoughtfully engaged? Well, like I said, not only is intelligence the exchange of information, and language is a challenge to that, we have to get past those differences, those barriers of languages, and constantly be not only thinking, but as well writing. If it's not written, it's forgotten. And if it's not written, it's not shared with the universe. And so as we think and as we write, we need to also be the plaintiffs as much as the defendants of these things around ethics and AI, ethics and data, and build the bridges of understanding that lead not only to business understanding, but as well as understanding in places like education centers, as well as, importantly, in government. So to wit is to be the thinkers, the writers, the plaintiffs, the defendants, and the builders of bridges to those very important categories: education, business, government.
Dave, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'll just add that, I think the data science community is very good at the technical side, and we love to get wrapped up in our algorithms and keep our heads in our algorithms. But the community, we need more of these, data citizen scientists that get involved in what's happening outside of the technical work. So one of the things I'll point to is the Informs ethical guidelines. And we talk about, the analytics professionals' responsibility to society, to their organization, and to the profession. So for example, 2 of them, one is accountability for our professional actions and the impacts of our work. Another is, be alert to the possible unintended or negative consequences that our results and recommendations may have on others. So I would encourage everyone in the data science community, to look at the Informs ethical guidelines, or there are other ethical guidelines for different societies and organizations out there, and understand what's acceptable to you, or when you might need to push back, or when you might need to elevate a concern that you might have about something that's being done. You need to understand your ethical boundaries before a need arises, because if you're all of a sudden faced with an ethical problem, it's difficult to make rational decisions in the moment. So that would be my advice.
So let me kind of expand on that a little bit. I know from conversations we've had in the past, right, all 3 of us wear risk management hats in different ways. And for the policymaking community that's watching this, as we think about ethics and emerging technologies, where are we most at risk? What does the policy community need to be thinking about in those terms? Dave, maybe we'll continue with you first.
Sure, Jeff. I'm going to bring up 2, if you don't mind. So the first one is this, it's human-facing machine learning systems that are used to change or manipulate behavior. So that concerns me quite a bit. If you think about things like deep fakes, which are these videos built with artificial intelligence that are made to look very real. Russia, for example, created a deep fake of President Zelensky of Ukraine, appearing to tell all Ukrainians to put down their weapons and surrender at the start of the invasion. Meta and YouTube removed these videos. and people that apparently, are familiar with President Zelensky could tell that they were fake. They said his head was too big and his voice was too deep. So they could identify it as a fake, but the technology is improving. It's going to be very difficult to identify what is real and what is not real with these fake messages out there. The other thing to think about with these human-facing machine learning systems are children and addictions to social media. California has a law that's it's proposed, it hasn't been passed, that would allow parents and the Attorney General to sue social media companies on behalf of children who are harmed as a result of addiction to social media. Of course, the counter argument is that the parents should be monitoring and controlling social media use. But you have also IoT, the Internet of Toys. So you have these toys that are collecting data on children. So those things, concern me. But the other one I want to talk about just briefly is the future of jobs. And there is quite a bit of debate about whether AI will lead to a net increase or a net decrease in jobs. But either way, there's going to be a huge disruption because many of the tasks, especially those that rely on computation and rules rather than judgment, are going to be automated and shifted to AI. So it's going to lead to a large-scale redefinition of job functions. Existing jobs will be consolidated and the tasks will be transferred. I personally tend to be a little pessimistic in this area and think there will be a lot of job loss. I mean, one example, there's 2 million truck drivers out there. There's billions of dollars being poured each year into autonomous vehicles. And so truck drivers, Uber, Lyft, taxi, these jobs will become obsolete at some point. 100 years ago, there were over 850,000 coal miners in the US. Today, there's less than 50,000. Now, recently, the shift toward renewable energies is driving some of that, but most of those job losses are due to technology and mining improvements. There was no reinvestment to retrain those miners, so Southern West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky have some of the highest poverty rates in the nation at this point. The difference with AI is that, it's not going to be the truck drivers or the coal miners or the software developers. It's going to touch every single industry. And so we need to plan for the workforce of the future and how people will be retrained to be productive in an AI-driven economy.
Thanks, Dave. Those are some really excellent points for us to be thinking about. Aaron, do you want to add on anything?
Yeah, so I'm a lot less pessimistic than Dave is in this regard. And this is one of the great exchanges that Dave and I often have in this regard. And so for the legislatures and all those who are watching, let me emphatically say, look to the future. I was in Miami recently, and this very same topic came up at Miami-Dade College. So the largest community college in the United States, graduating minorities and underprivileged, right? These are folks that we need to be very concerned about. The same folks that have traditionally gone on to be our electrical journeymen or the truck drivers, right? So are those community colleges, those blue collar curriculum, no longer valuable? No, they are changing. They are going through a chrysalis. We're in a moment of great hastening. So while the truck drivers are going away, and David cited a large number of jobs, just a quick look, you'll go and see that, there are 230,000 new solar power jobs, for example, in the US alone. And I could go on and find other things. So if you've ever been to any kind of an automated warehouse, you'll see that, yes, these robots move huge aisles around autonomously. But there are as many human pickers pulling from those aisles. Those might be automated some days, but they're not yet. So there are many more human pickers than there are these eating the shelves. And then there are these fleets of persons that are on 24/7 call to maintain those robots, to program those robots, to do a lot of the maintenance. So what I'm saying is, if you can imagine all of those millions of truck drivers going away, how many more maintainers are going to be needed? How many more programmers are going to be needed? How many more people at the depot points are going to be needed to load and offload those trucks? What I believe we're going to see, and what I've written a little bit about in Forbes and have even shared in other keynotes, is the emergence of what I'll call blue collar AI, or new blue collar jobs that are going to be focused on some very technical practices like Miami Dade is creating. They are creating the first 2-year certificate in artificial intelligence and a baccalaureate in artificial intelligence. These are things that academia and legislatures of yesteryear have said require 6- and 8-year degrees. I think David at Oliver Wyman and me and the places where I've worked would agree that we don't need more PhDs. We need many, 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 many more data farmers and data miners and data welders, this blue collar cadre that builds out this base of the pyramid that truly enable us then to take it out to these millions of autonomous robots, be it trucks or cranes or gantry arms that are going to move things where humans have typically operated. So I believe there's going to be a new type of work, just like the stagecoachman wasn't needed anymore, or maybe even the aqueduct engineer could never tell you what bottled water would look like or how it would be. There's going to be this metamorphosis, this change, this evolution of the jobs, and hopefully we'll respond quickly to it, faster than our competitors in the world, to create these programs in community colleges and the like that will help people not only maintain a standard of living, but transform into the future of work.
Great.
So if I could, I'm sorry, Jeff. I'm not disagreeing with you, Aaron. I mean, I think particularly people entering the workforce are going to have the training. The people that I'm more concerned about are like mid-career people whose jobs will be obsolete at some point. And how do you retrain those people so that we don't end up with a new Rust Belt or new, poverty areas like Southern West Virginia? I mean, those are the people that I'm concerned about. I just think that the policies have to be built around that. To provide education, retraining, and to protect those people.
One of the things I'm most hopeful about, Dave, is the greatest or the boomers, that generation is now tending to go towards retirement. And so whether or not there was this digital transformation, it's almost as if the world had set us up for a great knowledge exchange regardless of digital transformation, right? The boomers were going to have to entertain and educate the Zennials and now Generation Alpha, I guess is what they're being called. And so notwithstanding that great knowledge transformation, there is also this opportunity to have this aging workforce almost divest of the old way. And like you said, Dave, that middle and younger generation, us really emphasize, hopefully, emphatically as a nation, emphasize what that next work looks like. And it can't just be a few community colleges being first actors. There needs to be a national imperative. Let me say this real quick, Jeff, because I know you're on Capitol Hill oftentimes. One of the great arguments, one of the great concerns I have is that, China has asserted that they will be AI dominant by 2030. I'm looking at my calendar on the bottom right of my screen here. That's 8 years away. And we said, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence said, oh yeah, well, we'll do it by 2025. Well, if I ask you and I ask our neighbors, what have we really done about it? Every single time I ask that question, I've had people say, not a lot. So what can we do? If we started a student today, by 2025, too late. We can't groom or grow a classic AI engineer in time to be AI superior. We would barely cross the threshold by 2030. So as opposed to reaching for top shelf AI and thinking that we have to turn out PhD after PhD, we need to continue with that program and those very important education epicenters. But we also need to turn towards, and I'll say it again, the blue collar AI workforce that's going to form the basis of this pyramid and be interacting with these future autonomous robots and the places that will be part and parcel to how we do AI. One more thing, and I think Dave will probably like to build on this. Oftentimes when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about data and we get into questions about data ethics, it surrounds issues like policing, or it surrounds issues like military and surveillance. You know what? I want to say that those are the easy dystopian programs to associate these ethical concerns with. Now, why we should be concerned with those? I think we should be first concerned, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and data and democracy. We should be concerned with how that data and how that AI is helping my garbage get picked up from my curb on time, or how the pothole gets repaired, or how the water and electricity gets more precisely metered. We sometimes want to reach for these top shelf, very complex tasks. The way in which we can garner the trust and confidence of the American citizenry is by showing how AI and data adds value to the day-to-day parts of our life, how garbage and pothole and energy gets better. And then we'll have the faith and confidence that our government and our businesses know how to deliver and land it on important, critical programs like military, surveillance, security, and defense.
So let me jump in there, right? Because I think you guys have just touched on a number of very interesting, very important things. But as you're talking about that trust, Aaron, right? AI is in the news often for any number of reasons, big and small. There was a story recently about whether one company's AI had gained self-awareness, and which of course evokes images from, pick your sci-fi thriller, but it also sparks a wide range of really practical questions and concerns for the policy community. So with that in mind, all of this, as AI continues to emerge and evolve, opens a debate about whether AI is a solution or if it's a problem, or if it's both, not just in terms of the instantiation of AI itself, but from the ethical perspective. And I'm curious, from both of your perspectives, how do you view that twist on this complex question? Dave, I'll start with you.
Sure. The article you mentioned, I know the company backed away very quickly from the employees' claims, and when you read the details of what this employee was claiming, it comes down to what Aaron started off with, that semantics and language. What was his definition of a computer gaining consciousness? So, but if you think about this whole debate around whether AI is a solution or a problem, AI in many ways has cemented and even amplified biases that existed already in society. A well-known case that Aaron mentioned, the predictive policing models. The models originally were using historical data to predict crime rates and assign police officers to areas based on these models. But of course, when you assign more police officers to an area, then you have more opportunities to discover crimes and things going wrong, which increases the number. So you assign more police officers there, and you end up with a large spiral that just creates a bigger imbalance. So whether AI provides a solution or a problem really depends on how we choose to respond to the results. And I want to talk just a little bit about one of my colleagues in London, works at our Oliver Wyman's London office, Sean Townsend, who published an article in the Harvard Business Review, AI can make bank loans more fair. And so from her article, she says, as banks increasingly deploy AI tools to make credit decisions, they're having to revisit an unwelcome fact about the practice of lending. Historically, it has been riddled with biases against protected characteristics, such as race. And she provides an example that one lender discovered that historically, women would need to earn 30% more than men on average to qualify for the same size loan. And so this is not only a PR nightmare for these banks, but it's also just bad business practice, because these biases are unjustly rejecting many low-risk loans that they should be accepting. So the problem, though, is that it's just not that easy to correct. I mean, you can't say, oh, there's a bias, let's just get rid of it and move on. If you want to correct it, I mean, it's humans can't really detect the unfairness in these massive data sets. It's just very hard. So what they're starting to do is use AI to root out these biases in different areas. So one thing is that they'll run AI models on the data at the very start, before they even build the model, to try to go to the raw data and see if there are biases there that they can eliminate through the AI. Another thing is in the model itself to pick better goals that discriminate by incorporating things like an unfairness score. So if you take two people with the same exact risk profile, but they're from different classes, say one is a man and one is a woman, then they should have the same risk profile. And so you want to try to minimize that gap in that risk profile. And then a third option is to introduce a second AI model that's run on the results that goes through and looks and tries to identify biases. So there isn't really an easy way to get rid of these biases. But in this case, I am very optimistic that as AI starts identifying them and we see them, that we can help to reduce them.
Aaron?
I'll say that bias is all around us. It is a part of our daily life. Jeff, if you and I were to go out and buy the exact same suit coat, I as a 5'6" man and you as a 6'3" man are going to buy the same coat and pay the same price. Is there bias in that? Isn't there different amounts of fabric and effort to create the extra large versus the medium coat? What I want to say is it depends on how much you want to break this down and truly understand the biases that are around us, independent of color and race, but also in stature, income, and where you live. Where you live is not independent of how much you make, and probably not independent of your education and the other opportunities that are afforded you in life. So to think that we can just have algorithms and data without bias divine what decisions ought to be, I think is a bit foolhardy and a little bit of naive to the bias that exists in society and how we are programmed. Now, that's what's great about it. By investigating the data and looking at these models, we can, with some transparency, begin to see, well, maybe things aren't wired fairly. And how do we start to push for that? And it's not going to be pushed for just out of the model, but it's going to be pushed out of what we do as humans in our daily interactions, in our policies, in our laws, and in our admittance criteria. I think if we don't do that, it is pretty artificially intelligent. So if we are going to be more intelligent than just artificially intelligent, I think we also have to get back and understand, really what is intelligence. Intelligence is not merely the output of an algorithm. And sentience is not merely intelligence. And consciousness is not merely sentience. So what I'm bringing up there and kind of where I'm maybe taking us on to the next line of discussion is consciousness is not an algorithm, as much as sentience is not intelligence. And so as we start to understand what is it as humans we are seeking to do with these algorithms, are we really seeking to just create an artificially intelligent system? Are we seeking to develop consciousness? Or are we seeking to improve our own consciousness and our conscious or unconscious bias? Hopefully you follow.
So I think to that end, let's get on to our last question of the day. Right, as we're thinking about bias and consciousness, I know from the many conversations I've had on Capitol Hill over the years that the policy community has been looking at and thinking very hard about the policy and technology questions around how to address the data ethics issues, including algorithmic bias. And so from both of your perspectives, I think we'd love to hear, are there policies that the federal government ought to explore to help address these issues so that we get to whatever level of fairness and equity is appropriate? So Aaron, I'll just pick up with you so you can continue where you left off.
Yeah, well, I would say the number one thing I would call for us to do is to create 2 national standards. And it'd be hard for us to think that we would have reliable dentists if there wasn't a national dentistry standard, right? And so we need to have standards for how analytics and algorithms and data are evaluated. We need to have a consistent and standardized framework for how they're measured. Dave offered 3, I said 6. I've seen models with 18, but it'd be great whether it was done by government or done by a leading society like Informs to say, here is the model. And this is how you can track and trace and revisit annually and recertify, your maturity or your capability or your prudence in evaluating along those terms for the delivery, for the use of data, algorithms, and the information derived thereof. That's one. The second thing we need to do as a country and as businesses, as society, is really settle in on what that DDS or what that PhD is for analytics, data, and artificial intelligence. For me, and one thing that I clearly support is the certified analytics professional. But what is going to be that standard for how we identify the folks who are truly professionals in their field? Perhaps they are not the thoracic surgeons and they specialize in this super defined field, and there are other certifications and certificates and programs and training for that. But just as any surgeon goes in and gets their general certificate and license to perform a surgery, they then go subspecialize in other fields, that to me is what the cap is. It is the bar. It is the level you cross that then you go and subspecialize in for further abilities to demonstrate things across, everything from neural nets to robotic process automation. So for me, the two things that are needed is a national standard and framework for the delivery and use of analytics and data. And then second, the way in which we measure and certify those folks who are today certified, perhaps tomorrow regulated or even licensed.
Thanks. Dave?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Aaron has certainly touched on something, and I would argue that in the certifications and the PhD programs, there should be a heavy dose of ethics in there as well. Getting, for the topic we're talking about today. If we think about policies, I mean, I'm not going to get very specific here, but I would put them into two broad categories. One is just protection of fundamental human rights. If you look at something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are things in there about, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with their privacy. I mean, I see there's a question here about surveillance capitalism and what you do about that. And so that really starts getting into people's privacy, when you're surveying them, watching their movements. I mean, I understand there are safety reasons you would want to do that or defense reasons. But you don't want to start invading people's fundamental human rights. I mean, there are other ones in there about entitlement to equity and an impartial tribunal. I mean, that gets back to this parole programs that have been identified as biased. Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and their families. Well, that gets into some of the job stuff Aaron and I were talking about. Everyone has a right to freedom of opinion and expression. Well, that's a tough one, of course. I mean, we're seeing a lot of debate around hate speech being put onto social media sites, and should it be removed, should it not be removed? But when I think about this, I take it to mean that freedom of opinion should mean that people are not manipulating your opinions and manipulating your ability to make self-determination. The other area beyond the human rights that I would talk about a little bit is just that there need to be regulations to protect against bad actors. And so if you consider, for example, an autonomous tanker truck filled with gasoline that maybe is electronically hijacked by a hacker, and their intent is to run it into a crowd or run it into a building. So autonomous vehicles are going to have a kill switch on them so that police officers can stop a vehicle if it's determined to be a danger. So we need to really think through these worst case scenarios and enact regulations that protect the public from these bad actors. So those are the two areas I would focus on.
I applaud Dave on that, right? The famous trolley car problem, and then what is going to be the government's responsibility in that. Spot on.
Great. So I saw that we have one question in the chat. I know we're running a little bit short on time, but Dave, there was a question, well, Dave and Aaron, that came up about surveillance capitalism. And I'm curious if either one of you want to try to address that right now. For all viewers, by the way, additional questions that you have, please get in touch with me. My email address will be on the screen at the end, but jeff.cohen@informs.org. I'm happy to arrange briefings with David or Aaron or other members. But in terms of surveillance capitalism, David or Aaron, do you want to take a quick stab at that?
Could you read the question? Because I don't think I see it.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so the question is, what about how AI and data contributes towards surveillance capitalism, i.e. Google mining and selling our data for advertisements, et cetera? Seems like with a lack of privacy legislation in anticipation of stronger AI and data, that it could be easily abused. Seems like it could be an assault on human autonomy and affect unhuman behavior in ways that bypass user awareness, undermining free will.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I mean, I'm going to always come down on the side of protecting human rights. So I'm going to protect privacy, you know, any kind of manipulation, you know, things like the Cambridge Analytica, where they, I don't know if you're familiar with that case, but it was a company that illegally collected data through Facebook. They used it for a purpose that they said they weren't using it for. And then they multiplied that and grabbed everyone's friends on Facebook and they multiplied it to millions of data of people. And then they claimed they had 5,000 data points on every person. And they used that to create very targeted ads to identify hot button issues to get you to vote in a certain way in an election. So I'm always, you know, anything like that, I'm obviously very opposed to. I want to protect human rights, but also there's a delicate balance there in that AI is driven by data, and you have to have the ability to collect this data and use this data to advance AI, because some countries don't care as much about human rights. And so we have to be careful that we don't fall behind. So how do you create that balance, you know, between allowing, not stifling innovation, but still protecting human rights? I always lean more toward the human rights side, but it is a delicate balance there.
Hey Jeff, I want to suggest that I don't have an answer, but this goes back to what I led with, that this community, our community, needs to work together to be the thinkers, to be the writers, the defendants and the plaintiffs, and the builders of bridges, to be ready to form the opinions that will come out of a greater social consciousness as we consider it. I'll say this, with regard to your question about AI capitalism, it is amazing to think the amount of data exhaust I put out before 8 a.m. this morning. So not only did my Alexa alarm wake me up, but then I went and I scrolled my news feed, input a couple of things that I had in terms of supplements before I went and I ran with my O-ring on, and before I hopped in my car and ran to the DMV, that happened to, you know, provide me, you know, not only when I would get there, but as well as my scheduled appointment. By 8 a.m., you know, I had probably loaded more data than had been written in probably one of the earliest centuries of man on myself and my movement alone. So as we begin to work with this, I applaud the folks in the Europes who have come up with GDPR. I think more legislation, more consideration will be needed for that. But ultimately, we're going to have to understand that it's an economy, it's a world you participate in or you don't. And if you put a thing on your finger or on your wrist or in your hand, you are agreeing to enter those waters, and data exhaust is imminent. The protection will need to be determined.
We're going to take one final question that came in, Aaron. This one was specifically written to you about your comment on blue collar AI. And in particular, the question was about liability and how should accountabilities be assigned when AI makes, for instance, an autonomous decision that hurts someone, like an autonomous vehicle running into a crowd of people. Any thoughts on that to share?
Two quick thoughts. I think that's one that could have its very own symposium or meeting to answer. But I'll say this first. An axe never hurt anybody. An axe that was picked up and wielded by a human hurt somebody, either the user or the folks that it was maliciously used to intend. So I would say ultimately the AI or the data can never be at fault. It is the human that should be. Now where that liability is assigned to the person who developed it and purportedly, you know, this fleet and these legions of folks that I'm supposing come into the field use it. I don't believe it ever is just with the individual, but probably with the individual to the employer with whom they were assigned, or that had ultimately validated their work, right? When you and I go in for surgery, and if the surgery goes bad, I don't necessarily sue the surgeon, but I'll sue the hospital or the healthcare provider, right? And so there's certain liabilities that I think are going to be extensible across data and artificial intelligence, like we've seen there elsewhere in other fields of employment. And I think this is to me, this is kind of obvious, and it should be something that we are crafting on a national agenda sooner than later.
Just briefly, Jeff, I like to think about that as an autonomous vehicle. And if you have a doll in that autonomous vehicle, and you can set that dial to be, egotistical, that I want to protect myself above all else, or I can be altruistic and say I want to protect anybody. I don't care about myself, but I would feel really bad if I injured or killed someone else. Or there are different settings on this dial. How would you set that dial? Would you set it differently if it was your child in the car as opposed to you? But the key thing is who gets to set that dial? Somebody's going to be setting that dial. And it's probably not going to be you. Is it going to be the auto manufacturer? Is it going to be the insurance agencies? Is it going to be the federal government or the state government? But who gets to set that dial? And whoever sets that dial is going to have the ultimate, the accountability for what happens to that vehicle.
David, Aaron, it's always a fascinating conversation when we get both of you going. I appreciate that. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. For those of you watching, as I mentioned earlier, if you have any follow-ups for either David Hunt or Aaron Burciaga, please feel free to get in touch with me at jeff.cohen@informs.org or jcohen@informs.org. Both will work. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for other future webinars on issues pertinent to analytics, operations research, and the science and technology of decision-making. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.